Okay, welcome back. Um, book, I don't know, what is it, 23 now?
I think
23.
so.
So we're doing Man's Search for Meaning. I'm going to give us the usual introduction and then we can dig into it.
Cool.
Cool. Okay, so Man's Search for Meaning is a book by Holocaust survivor and psychotherapist Viktor Frankl. The book looks at the suffering experienced in the concentration camps, and how finding meaning allows one to survive even the harshest of conditions. For Frankl, there are three sources of meaning. There's work, which is creating work or doing a deed. Then there's love, which is experiencing something or encountering someone. And then there's courage, which is, in his case, the attitude that we take towards unavoidable suffering. So those are the three, and then it carries on. He looks at three different phases of camp life and the symptoms accompanying them. So that's the period following admission, which is shock and denial, and then the period one is well entrenched in camp routine, which normally they experience apathy and what he calls emotional death. And then there's the period following one's release and liberation, which he says normally is accompanied by reintegration and emotional disorientation. So Frankl analyzes each of these three phases and discusses the stories he experienced in the various different camps, and how in those situations some lose the will to meaning while others hold on. Then, in the closing third of the book, he discusses the school of psychotherapy that he founded, which is called logotherapy, from the rich Greek word logos, which can be translated word or reason or meaning, and it describes the therapeutic technique whose main focus is to help the patient regain their unique life's meaning, their logos. Cool. So yeah, that's the introduction. So as you can sort of already pick up, I think Viktor Frankl is quite enamored with the idea of finding meaning, and
Yeah.
even the logotherapy school of psychotherapy that he founded is based on that idea of meaning. Yeah, I don't know if you have any initial thoughts there before we jump in, Peter.
No, no, nothing. It's just I think you have summarized it well about the three different parts. I think when you started mentioning the three different parts, I was like, what three different parts did I miss when I was reading the book?
Yeah.
But yeah, the way you when you explain it, it's like, okay, no, it's just how the book is, because just to let everyone know, the book is actually one whole bundle up of the camp experience. So what
Yeah.
you then describe as them honestly being admitted into the camp. So to them experience life in the camp and the release part. That's all in um, one section.
Yeah.
I know this sounds bad, but to me, I almost felt as though the book was supposed to be written the other way around. But I guess the story is supposed to give a bit of a background before um, actually
The
touching on
therapy and
what the,
stuff.
the
Yeah.
therapy side of it, because essentially the two last parts actually then perfectly encapsulate what is explained in the story at the beginning. But I guess
Mm.
that's what I'm saying, hence why backstories are important. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's obviously a very different book to the book that we normally read, which is like a
Yeah.
very we self-help, straightforward, like these are the notes along the way and that. Whereas this is a bit of a story, and the next book as well will also do a slightly more of a story type book.
Mm.
But yeah, I think it's a very interesting book. I think I read it, sure, maybe 5 years or so ago,
Mm.
and I remember thinking like, I'm not. A lot of people speak about this book, and they're like, oh, it's one of their like top recommended books and that.
Mm.
And I read it, and I thought like that was back then. I thought, like, it's fun. Like it's not
Mm.
that great. But now rereading it, obviously I'm in a different phase of life, or I just understood it better,
Yeah.
or something. I don't know. but but now it gripped me a lot more. And I think he gives lots of interesting aspects of camp life, and
Mm.
he lays out his ideas in a, yeah, not, I wouldn't say in a super straightforward way, but it's like they tie well into the different stories and narratives that he gives.
Mm. Mm.
Real life narratives, should I mention?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Mm. Mm.
cool. Should we kick off with the preface?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So I'm gonna do the usual, although it's not gonna work in the exact same way as it normally has, because normally I'll skip through, or I'll sort of jump through a bunch of different quotes and then we'll discuss it. We're gonna try do the same sort of thing, but if it goes a little bit haywire, then forgive us. But because of the way that it's structured and things like that. But we're gonna try it. Should be all right. All right. So starting with the preface on page 7, he says, and this is one of the things that he loves to do. You'll see it throughout the book. Is quoting Nietzsche. So he says here, Nietzsche says, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow." And then the book carries on to say or the preface carries on to say, he describes poignantly prisoners who gave up on life, who had lost all hope for the future, and they were inevitably the first to die. They died less from a lack of food or of medicine than from a lack of hope, a lack of something to live for. By contrast, Frankl kept himself alive and kept hope alive by summoning up thoughts of his wife and the prospect of seeing her again after the war. And then, yeah, it carries on about also his psychological lessons, and that was also another driver. Then on the next page, Frankl, with the question of why most died, than it is, Frankl's concern is less with the question of why most died than it is with the question of why any survived at all. His experience in Auschwitz was, as terrible as it was, reinforced what was already one of his key ideas. Life is not primarily a quest for pleasure, as Freud believed, or a quest for power, as Alfred Adler thought, but a quest for meaning. And then further down, Frankl's most enduring insight: forces beyond your control can take away everything that you possess, except one thing: your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. And then lastly on page 9, we must learn to see life as meaningful despite our circumstances. So, yeah, there's a few things in that preface, and the preface isn't by Frankl, it's by Harold Kushinger, but it's kind of a summary of Frankl's ideas and thoughts in the book. And then, as you can sort of tell from one of Frankl's favorite quotes, is the "he who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow." That again points to the search for meaning, and that was like one of Frankl's, I guess, main reasons for surviving camp life, or at least that's what he would say.
Yeah. I mean, I know we'll probably dig deep into it later down, but it was just interesting. I think there was the one part where he was explaining periods in which they experienced a lot of loss, and it was because people had the notion that they would be released, let's say, when the New Year rolls around, or Christmas, and he said there was a lot of death around then. So it was as though, and again, which the book kind of speaks to, is that if you sort of are working towards something, I think once you've passed that point, your attitude towards life kind of changes. And I think in their case, for those that everything was leading to their release, had that disappointment when the release date, rolled around and passed away, they were still there. I mean, he even explains of
Yeah, they
the one
didn't get
guy, I don't know.
released. Yeah.
Yeah, there was the one part where it talks about, I don't know if it was a friend or this other, that was really looking, or said they would leave at the end of, was it a particular month or a particular period, and this was like the
Yes.
most
Yeah.
healthy of all men. But just after that, he, when that didn't happen, he literally died like 3 days after that, or shortly after
Yeah.
that. And it
Yeah.
was that like the moment, you know what a person's hoping for kind of is taken away, then they also lose hope in trying to survive. And it's very interesting,
Yeah.
to think of it in that sense that, you know, maybe unknowingly we just have these little set goals that give our lives meaning, and that's what pushes us forth. And the moment that sort of is taken away, other things, creep in. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very like powerful idea to reflect on, where you see all of those cases where people there's no ways they're going to make it out of this situation, or there's no ways they're going to make it through this cancer or X or Y or Z, and then somehow they do make it through. And it's Frankel would say, and I don't think I would disagree with him, that it comes down to what like, were they able to find a meaning or a purpose to sort of go towards, whether that's like family, or often it is family, and that I guess it comes back to community and how important that is. But yeah, and then surprisingly those people make it through even though they didn't have hope. Of course, that's not always the case. Sadly, many pass away despite having lots of hope in that. But yeah. Cool. Okay, so then if we jump forward to this is Viktor Frankl's preface to the 1992 edition of this book, which is fairly recent. I mean, it's not super recent, but it's, yeah. It, for some reason, feels like the book should be older than it is. Because, yeah. Okay, the page 12, he says here, and this is Frankl making a note, thinking about how he wrote this book, and he wasn't actually wanting to publish this book with his name on it. He wanted to publish it anonymously, and then he ended up putting his name on it and things. But he says here that the book basically became obviously extremely famous and popular, and he had written a bunch of other books, and then this one out of all of them becomes the famous one, which is ironic because this is the one that he didn't intend for, like, it to be widely spread and become famous or make him famous. So he says here, don't aim at success more than you aim at it. Make it a target. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you are going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effects of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as a byproduct of surrender to a person other than oneself. So yeah, I thought that was a nice comment. It's not really exactly related to all of the other stuff in the book, but I guess it does tie in with the meaning idea as well. Then on page 13, I'm not going to really read through it too much, but essentially it's the story of him going into camps, like, or how did he end up becoming one of the Holocaust survivors. And he says basically he was going to flee, and he received an invitation to the American consulate, and his parents were very happy because they would because it was then that he could leave Austria and avoid, I guess, the issues and stuff that were about to come. Because I assume at this point they already knew what was going to happen because of Hitler already starting to take over and do things. And then he ended up saying, okay, where does my responsibility lie? Because I'm either going to leave my parents or I'm going to stay here. And then he basically ended up staying because he asked, uh, after while telling the story, basically says to his father that, like, what was this note in your I think it was in his pocket or something. And then he said, oh, it was one of the 10 Commandments. And then he said, oh, which one? And then he said, honor your father. But his parents wanted him to go. And then he heard that and he was like, okay, no, I'm going to have to stay with my parents. And then obviously because of that, he knew that the camp side of things was going to happen. So yeah, an interesting story. And it also kind of just goes down to show you have some decisions that you can make in that, but at the same time there's lots of things that are completely outside of your control. And this like I would guess a lot of people would say very important book came from that decision that he was going to stay and yeah, be with his aging parents. But yeah, quite something.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments there before we move on to the like meat of the book.
No, I have nothing. I think you covered everything from that.
I've been talking a lot. Okay, so then let's go to experiences in camp concentration. This is part 1 of the book, and part 1, like I mentioned, is the bulk of the book. And then towards the end is the logotherapy part, like Peter mentioned. Yeah, so page 18, he says here, and this is for the outsider, little does he know how hard the fight for existence which raged among the prisoners. This was an unrelenting struggle for daily bread and for life itself, for one's own sake or for that of a good friend. Then on to the next page, he says, there was neither time nor desire to consider moral or ethical issues. Every man was controlled by one thought only, to keep himself alive, for family waiting for him at home, and to save his friends. Then a bit further down, on average, those prisoners were prepared, or they were prepared to use every means, honest or otherwise, even brutal force, theft, betrayal of friends, and all in order to save themselves. We who have come back, so I think he's talking about himself and all of the survivors, we who have come back by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not survive. So, yeah, that's... let me read this and then we can chat about it. But last thing on page 20, former prisoners often say, we dislike talking about our experiences. No explanations are needed for those who have been inside, and others will understand neither how we felt nor even how we feel now. So yeah, I'm glad that some of them put down their thoughts, because I think it does help, even though we can't really relate to what's happened, it does help as well, give perspective on life. But yeah, it's interesting to see him saying the people who were actually good, kind people, those were the ones that didn't survive because, or the best of them didn't survive because, yeah, it was brutal. Yeah.
I mean, in one of the prefaces, there was also that whole reference to where the whole "why do good things happen to good people" part, and I think it was highlighted in that, like what you're saying, like most good people survive. But I think something else that you kind of see that comes along, as you read through the book, is that people's character also seem to come out.
Yeah.
People that you generally consider good, would change, just because of the need to act a certain way if you actually needed to survive in the camps. As it said, life there was kind of brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Glad we didn't have to go through anything like that, and Lord willing, we won't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, so on page 23, he gives that overview that I mentioned of the 3 phases. So he says here, 3 phases of an inmate's mental reactions to camp life become apparent. The period following his admission, the period when he is well entrenched in camp routine, and the period following his release and liberation. And then he says here that the symptom that characterizes that first phase is shock. So basically what we're going to go through now is a few different things relating to that first phase. And then he goes on to the second phase, and then the third phase, and then he kind of closes off. And then he goes on to logotherapy. So yeah, first phase, they kind of just entering into the camp, and they kind of just started seeing the, I guess, horrors of the situation. And then he says here on page 23, in psychiatry, there's a certain condition known as delusion of reprieve. The condemned man, immediately before his execution, gets the illusion that he may be reprieved at the very last minute. Then he goes on to the next page to say, nearly everyone in our transport lived under the illusion that he would be reprieved, that everything would yet be well. And I can imagine that, like, it's so shocking that your brain basically just doesn't want to allow you to believe what's happening to you.
But also, and just to cut in, like, in essence, from what I gathered, they were not aware of where they were heading. Or am I wrong to think that?
I am not 100% sure. I thought that it seemed like they did, but I don't know if they knew the extent of it.
Yeah.
But I think that they knew that it was gonna just be like brutal camp prisoner. I mean, brutal like prisoners of Hitler.
Yeah, to me, it gave me the sense that they didn't quite know, like you're saying, the extent of it. Because remember, like you're saying, what they were hanging on is to like, oh, we have our staff, because going there, it was as if like they were given the opportunity to pack some stuff and all that kind of stuff. Yet when they got there, everything was taken away from them. Like it didn't seem them going there. Yes, like you're saying, they knew they were going to some. So, and again, I think, so I could be wrong, but I remember it was more of they were going to help out in certain industries. That was kind of how they were brought in, to be like, there's need of manpower in this sort of industry or factory or whatnot, come along. So it was, as much as it was against their will, but they were kind of promised much better conditions than what they then faced.
Okay. Yeah, you might be right. I'm definitely the wrong person to answer with confidence there. My understanding of history is shocking to say it well.
No, same,
but yeah,
but it's not even from the history. It's like just from how he threats some of the things, like remember how he described that trend right there, getting there. They still had hopes that it was something different. Then there was a whole separation thing, and also knowing that they were not going to the one camp and they still had their things, then like you're saying, the admit process took several stages, because they
Yeah.
were separated, and then they would get to a point where they still had their watches and whatnot, and then the guards started to then take what seemed valuable to them. And I mean, he still hid a few things, but eventually, at the last part, is when they had to then take off everything and be hosed down and everything.
Yeah.
That's when kind of reality kicked in to be like, oh, okay, this is what we're actually in for,
Yeah. 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 I think the broad picture there is right. But I don't know if it was like they were sort of tricked into. Yeah. But on page 25, he kind of touches on a little bit of what you said there. So it reads, the forefinger of that hand he pointed very leisurely to the right or to the left. None of us had the slightest idea of the sinister meaning behind that little movement of a man's finger, pointing now right and now to the left. Somebody whispered to me that to be sent to the right would mean work, and the way to the left being for the sick and those incapable of work, who would be sent to a special camp. Then going further down, this building, I was told by someone who worked there, had the word bath written all over its doors in several European languages. On entering, each prisoner was handed a piece of soap, and then, but mercifully, he says, I don't need to describe the events which followed. Many accounts have been written about this horror. So obviously, that was I assume, the gas chambers. And so the pointing to the right or to the left, if you were in decent physical condition, then they would obviously take you to work. But if you weren't, then you would go for a bath. But it actually wasn't the bath. It was, the end for you, unfortunately. Yeah, quite something. I think he goes on to say he didn't realize. So there was an answer from one of them where they saw in the distance a sinister cloud of smoke, and then he says, "That's where your friend is That's where your friend is floating up to heaven." And that was an answer to him when he asked what's going on. And then he says here, but I still did not understand the truth that was explained to me in plain words. And then, after a while, he realizes what they meant by the smoke is the friend going up to heaven. So, quite something. I can't even, relate at all. It's just so distant of a thing that there's, yeah. Anyway, going to 29. Thus the illusions some of us still held were being destroyed one by one, and then quite unexpectedly, most of us were overcome by a grim sense of horror. We knew that we had nothing to lose except our ridiculously naked lives. Then further down, there were so many surprises in store for new arrivals. The medical men among us learnt that all of the textbooks tell lies. Somewhere it said that a man cannot exist without sleep for more than a stated number of hours. Quite wrong. I had been convinced that there were certain things that I just could not do. I could not sleep without this, or I could not live without that or the other. Then he goes on further down. I would like to mention a few similar surprises on how much we could endure. We were unable to clean our teeth, and yet, despite that, and also despite several vitamin deficiencies, we had healthier gums than ever before. 4 days later, we were unable to wash, or for days we were unable to wash, even partially, because of frozen water pipes and yet the sores and abrasions on our hands, which were dirty from all the work in the soil, did not form pus. A light sleeper who used to be disturbed by the slightest noise in the next room now found himself lying pressed against a comrade who snored loudly a few inches from his ear, and yet slept quite soundly through the noise. So yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts there, Peter.
Yeah, no, nothing much. Just like what she echoes to be like, theoretically it's always said like sleep so many hours, etc., etc. But he kind of explains that you are able to survive without not encouraging that we don't need to sleep and everything. It's just
Yeah.
I think it's going back to say like if you're in survival mode, anything can be thrown at you and you will learn to survive through those situations. Like no matter how hard. And I think we spoke about this to be like maybe not here, but I know it's a conversation I've had before. To be like you are shaped by your experiences. You know what your limits are or what they're not after you've gone through a certain experience. There's things that are just on a high level kind of, oh, do not do this, do not do that. But I think you realize the depth of what it means the moment you've experienced it. Yes, you are able to be sympathetic to others that are experiencing loss and whatnot, but I think the real depth of it once you've also experienced loss in that same form, And I think this is just similar to that, to be like, yes, you might have been told of how bad things are, but you know the extent of how they are after you've actually been in them. I mean, for instance, I'm a snorer, and I've been on camps and stuff, and everyone's like, "You're dude, you snore," and you're like, fair. I mean, I give them ample warning, but I mean, it doesn't. But for him to be like, yeah, you will make a plan to sleep even if you sleeping next to the loudest snorer, Like,
Yeah, if you really can't sleep for a long time, you will end up sleeping next to almost anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of stuff reminds me of a few different things. There's one thing that often people will mention about hair and washing hair, and how you don't actually need to wash your hair. I still do, and the same with deodorant and stuff. Like a lot of people seemingly don't wear deodorant at all, but we are very culturally conditioned to wear deodorant. And okay, sure, there's some people that have much worse body odors than others in different situations, but for the most part, that's the thing, like brushing teeth and stuff like that. I often wonder about stuff like that. It's I think it's very good to brush teeth for modern humans because of the amount of sugar that we eat. But that aside, it's interesting that the different things, like I'm sure toothpaste wasn't always a thing, and etc. etc. And all of these things that we taught, and then it's also on a sort of happier, although for new parents it may be not a happy thought, but the amount of sleep that you can survive on if you have a newborn, seemingly, as far as I understand, you're constantly being woken up and yet people manage to be fine. Like they carry on with life and stuff, and sure, they would like more sleep, but they, at the end of the day, they carry on as normal human beings. Yeah, it's interesting. Like we are very comfortable at the moment, which it goes back to the Socrates idea of sometimes, not the Socrates, the Stoic idea of sometimes having sleeping on the floor and doing those kinds of things to give yourself a bit of a okay, I can actually survive this It's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Yeah, a war camp or that kind of thing would be a very different situation. But yeah. Okay, should we head to page 33?
Yeah.
So he says here, these reactions, as I've described them, began to change in a few days. The prisoner passed from the first phase, that's the shock and on the initial entrance to the camp, to the second phase, the phase of relative apathy, in which he achieved a kind of emotional death. And he carries on. If, as usually happens, this is like a little story to explain the kind of things that happened in camp life. If, as usually happens, some of the excrement splashed into the face of someone during the transport on bumpy fields, any sign of disgust by that prisoner or any attempt to wipe off the filth would only be punished by a blow from a capo. So that's one of the sort of I guess I can't remember if the capos are the guards or if they...
No.
Yeah.
They're the trusted prisoners.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, so there were different ranks. Is it the SS that were the guards? Hey?
Yeah, the SS are the guards, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it would result in a blow from the capo. Then he carries on a bit further. He heard a scream and saw how a comrade was knocked down. The prisoner, who had passed into the second phase of his psychological reactions, didn't avert his eyes anymore. By then, his feelings were blunted, and he watched unmoved. And then it carries on with different things like that. But the point is kind of that all of these, to us, absolutely shocking things would just happen. And after a while of just being continuously exposed to them, then he says here, apathy, the blunting of emotions, and the feeling that one could not care anymore were the symptoms arising from the second phase of the prisoner's psychological reactions, and which eventually made him insensitive to daily and hourly beatings. Yeah. I don't have any comments there other than just crazy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it was described early on, but I mean, this is the first time you mentioned the couples to be in whatever community you find yourself. There's somehow always a need to sort of form some sort of hierarchy, and I mean that's just an indication to that or essentially everyone was there as a prisoner of some sort, but within that, those two people that wanted to then rank themselves to be better than, and I mean, they were the ones that actually, I mean, I'm not saying that the SS did not treat the people that come bad, but it seemed like the couple also had their own fair share of trying to exercise their power,
Yeah. Yeah, and they would be very harsh, apparently, at times, as you sort of heard from the initial stories. Yeah. Okay, going on to page 40. So this is sort of carrying on with that second phase. Apathy, the main symptom of the second phase, was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. Reality dimmed all efforts and all emotions, and they were then centered on one task: preserving one's own life and that of the fellow of a fellow. And then it can be readily understood that such strain, coupled with a constant necessity of concentrating on the task of staying alive, forced the prisoner's inner life down to a primitive level. Then going on to page 45. It says here, in general, there was also a cultural hibernation in the camp. There were two exceptions for this: politics and religions. Politics were talked about everywhere in the camp, almost continuously. The discussions were based chiefly on rumors that were snapped up and passed around avidly. And then he goes on, the religious interest of the prisoners, as far and as soon as it developed, was the most sincere imaginable. The depth and vigor of religious belief often surprised and moved a new arrival. Most impressive in this connection were the improvised prayers or services in the corner of a hut, or in the darkness of a locked cattle truck in which we were brought back from a distant worksite, tired and hungry, frozen in our ragged clothing. And then on 47, in spite of all the enforced physical and mental primitiveness of the concentration camp, of life in the concentration camp, it was possible for spiritual life to deepen. Sensitive people who were used to the rich intellectual life may have suffered pain. They were often of delicate constitution, but the damage to their inner selves was less. They were able to retreat from the terrible surroundings of life to inner riches and spiritual freedom. Only in this way can one explain the apparent paradox that some prisoners of less hardy makeup often seem to survive camp better than those of a robust nature. That it reminded me of the idea of the inner citadel in Stoicism, and just basically having like at least reasonable control of your character and having a strong mental life allows you to reframe situations in ways that make them more palatable or escape in various different ways. And then along with the, like you mentioned, the spiritual life of camp prisoners, I think it makes a lot of sense that when you really just have nothing, that's when you tend to lean towards God more, because just like there's just nothing else that I can go to at this point. Which says something about us very busy people, but any further thoughts before we go on there?
No.
Okay, then on to page 48, and this is a really touching part. I'm not going to read the whole part, but I think it's a really it was touched on a little bit at the beginning about why one of the reasons why Frankl survived was because he was looking forward or striving to survive so that he could meet up with his wife again, whom he seemingly loved very much. So he says here on page 48, but my mind clung to the image, clung to my wife's image, imagining it with uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me, her smile, her frank and encouraging look. Real or not, her look was more luminous than the sun beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it's set to song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers, the truth that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. I don't think there's too much to add other than it just does seem to often come to that, like at the end of the day, to be truly loving and to love someone else or something else other than yourself is an unbelievably powerful thing in so many situations, even to the point of concentration camps and surviving them. Right. Page 50. He says here, this intensification of inner life helped the prisoner find a refuge from the emptiness, desolation, and spiritual poverty of his existence by letting him escape into the past. When given free rein, his imagination played with events, often not important ones. In my mind, I took bus rides, unlocked the front door of my apartment, answered my telephone. These memories could move one to tears. Yeah, it just another example of just how the things that we take for granted of just being able to come home, being able to, I mean, like if we have to go on a bus ride, we'll get frustrated that, why do I have to wait or a train ride or whatever the different cases. It's just like, okay, like let me just be there. But in camp, you just hoping for something like that. Like that's the dream almost. Yeah. It's interesting that those are the kind of things that he would reflect on.
Yeah. I mean, some of the things mentioned, you think it's like, it's more of the small things, that you end up realizing that you actually miss, and that's what kind of reminds you how different the world is out there.
Yeah. Yeah. He says on page 54 as well that humor was another one of the soul's weapons in the fight for self-preservation. And it's well known that humor, the more than anything else in the human makeup, can afford an aloofness and an ability to rise above any situation. Yeah, it's. I think a lot of like coping is also finding humor in the different things that are just absurd. Yeah.
I mean, there are times, I think often even, I don't know if you've experienced when, you find yourself in a certain situation that you just can't comprehend how you find yourself. The immediate reaction is just to laugh at the situation than anything else,
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It can be like that. Then page 57, which is basically about suffering being relative. He says here, and how we envied those of us who had the opportunity to get into a factory and work in a sheltered room. It was everyone's wish to have such a life-saving piece of luck. So, it's not funny is the wrong word. It's like, it's interesting to look at things like forced labor and that, which of course is like a terrible thing and it's not something that we should just like be like, it doesn't really matter. But it's interesting to look at a situation like this where they were obviously out in the cold the whole time. There's a point in one of his stories where he talks about there's like a grown man who had really good composure and was like a honorable person and that and he breaks into tears because his shoelace broke, which meant that I think it was that his feet were too swollen to be able to wear his shoes. And they would use like wire and stuff to try and keep the shoes tied, but the wires would sometimes break and that. And either his shoelace or the wire that held the shoe together broke. And then he basically just started crying because it meant that he would now have to go out and work barefoot in the freezing cold. And so I think that's the kinds of things that they have in mind when they're saying that it was everyone's wish to have such a life-saving piece of luck to go and work in a factory that had a sheltered room. Quite something. It's definitely, we normally say this at the end of the book, but it's definitely the kind of book that I think one should read to get a feeling for what was going on, because I think the different quotes and things from it give a bit of a sense of it, But just reading through the sort of story from Frankl's eyes, I think is, yeah, quite a moving thing.
Yeah.
Then on page 65, he says, now our transport from the rest of the camp was arranged for a second time. And again, no one knew whether this was a ruse to obtain a last bit of work from the sick, if only for 14 days, or whether it would go on to the gas ovens or to a genuine rest camp. And then he says, I told him that this was not my way, that I had learned to let fate take its course. So he was like, should he go or not? And then he was like, I'm just going to let it happen. And then the guy basically says to him, like, do you really want to go with him? And then he says, yeah, I'm going to go. And then on the next page, he says, we were not heading to the gas chambers. We actually did go to a rest camp. Those who had pitied me remained in the camp where there was famine, and where famine was to rage even more fiercely than in our new camp. They tried to save themselves, but they had sealed their own fates. And then he goes on to basically recount the story called Death in Tehran. So I'll read it quick, but this is a very, very fascinating story, but this is a fictional story. So he says, does this not bring to mind the story of death in Tehran? A rich and mighty Persian once walked into his garden with one of his servants. The servant cried that he had just encountered death, who had threatened him. He begged his master to give him the fastest horse so that he could make haste and flee to Tehran, which he could reach that same evening. The master consented, and the servant galloped off on the horse. On returning to his house, the master himself met death, and he questioned him. Why did you terrify and threaten my servant? I did not threaten him. I only showed surprise in finding him where I planned to meet him tonight in Tehran. So, yeah, basically the guy tries to escape by riding off to Tehran quickly, because he thought he was going to die in the place that he was, but it was by going to Tehran that he actually met his fate and died. And so the point that Frankl's raising there is, often we think we're doing things and that's the thing that's going to get us to this point or that point. Or in their case, quite dramatically, it's either the thing that's going to make us survive or not. And often it's not up to us, really.
And I mean, the interesting part about that part as well is that can also just show you how little they trusted those in authority or those actually saying stuff, because the destination of the transport wasn't actually explicitly mentioned, but they just thought that if there's a truckload of people leaving this place, the only destination for it is the gas chambers. You know, there's also that. And yeah, it's and also I think one thing that this kind of highlighted for me is that we always feel we're in a better off situation. You know, I think it's the comfort thing. As much as the situation might have been bad, the people got comfortable and knew their way around, and to them that was the best thing that could happen at any particular moment. And anything different to them, to that situation, seemed bad. And I think that's, and I know this is way off, but I think that's what also holds us back as human beings. You know, we always think that we're in a much better space, you know, and anything that comes our way that seems remotely different, we're most likely to resist to it, you know. And in this case, I mean, yes, there is a possibility that the transport could have headed somewhere different, but it just didn't happen this time, and, you know, it actually headed in a much better place, you know.
Yeah, and the thing is, you just don't know.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You just don't
And
know. You.
yeah, but yeah, it also shows, I think, just how, and he did mention this right at the beginning, but it's also a bunch of luck that he survived. It's not because he had only these character traits that he
Yeah.
was in search of meaning, and he found meaning in sort of trying to survive, to recreate this manuscript, and to meet his wife again. That's It's also because of fate. It wasn't. He happened to be on the right camp, or in the right camps and things like that. But yeah. So I'm going to jump through quite a few pages now, because it's kind of a little bit of a sort of narrative that he gives again. He says here, starting on page 67, should he make the attempt to flee, or should he take that risk? And then he says, I too experienced this torment. As the battlefront drew nearer, I had the opportunity to escape. Then he goes on to the next page. Suddenly, I decided to take fate into my own hands. So basically, he had ended up deciding, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to escape. And then he sees, so he was at that point seeing some patients, because he was, I think he was being a doctor or something along those lines. And then he was seeing a patient who basically was like, oh, are you escaping? And then he felt sort of this pull towards that person to, for their sake, not to escape, but to rather help them. He says, I think, his fellow countrymen. And then he says here, suddenly I decided to take fate into my own hands for once. I ran out of the hut and told my friend that I was not going to go with him. And as soon as I told him that I had finally made up my mind to stay with my patients, the unhappy feeling left me. And then it carries on. Our last day in camp arrived. As the battlefront came nearer, mass transports had nearly taken all the prisoners to other camps. The camp authorities, the capos, and the cooks had fled. On that day, an order was given. The camp must be evacuated completely by sunset. At night, the camp was to be set on fire. The remaining prisoners seemed to be destined to burn in the camp. For the second time, my friend and I decided to escape. So he says, like, no, you're not going to escape. And then now, a bit later, he's like, okay, no, I'm going to escape again. Then he says here, we had been given an order to bury 3 men outside the barbed wire fence. We now made our plans. Along with the first body, we would smuggle out my friend's rucksack. When we took the second body, we would also carry out my rucksack. And then on the third trip, we intended to make our escape. I was picturing freedom joyously, imagined how wonderful it would be to run towards the battlefront, but we did not get that far. The very moment when my friend came back, the camp gate was thrown open, and a splendid aluminium-colored car, on which was painted a large red cross, slowly rolled down to the parade ground. A delegate from the International Red Cross in Geneva had finally arrived. In the camp, and the camp and its inmates were under its protection. Who worried about escape now? Boxes with medicine were unloaded from the car. Cigarettes were distributed. We were photographed, and joy reigned supreme. Now there was no need for us to take the risk running towards the fighting line. So they were obviously planning on escaping, and just as they were about to escape, the Red Cross arrives to, I guess, sort of save them. And then he carries on. And so the last day at camp passed in anticipation of freedom, but we had rejoiced too early. The Red Cross delegate assured us that the agreement had been signed and that the camp must not be evacuated. But that night, the SS arrived with trucks and brought an order to clear the camp. We scarcely recognized the SS. They were so friendly, trying to persuade us to get in the trucks without fear, telling us that we should be grateful for our good luck. Then on the next page, finally we lay down on the mattress and deserted our guard room, exhausted by the excitement of the last few hours and days, during which we had fluctuated continuously between hope and despair. We slept in our clothes and shoes, ready for the journey. The noise of rifles and cannons woke us. Flashes of tracer bullets and gunshots entered the hut. The chief doctor dashed in and ordered us to take cover on the floor. So now all of this is happening, and it's basically because some of them went with the SS, and then some of them had stayed behind. I think it might have been just because there wasn't enough space or something like that. I can't remember. But some of them stayed behind, some of them went. And now those who are waiting are now in this situation where they hear the noise of rifles and cannons waking them, flashes of tracer bullets, gunshots. And so then this is happening. And then he says, then we grasped what was happening. The battlefront had reached us. The shooting decreased and morning dawned. Outside on the pole at the camp gate was a white flag floating in the wind. Many weeks later, we found out that even the last hours, fate had toyed with us, the few remaining prisoners. We found out just how uncertain human decisions are, especially in matters of life and death. Our friends, who had thought that they were traveling to freedom that night, had been taken in the trucks to this camp. And there they were locked in huts, and they were burned to death. I thought again of the story of the death in Tehran. So yeah, quite a whirlwind.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, for me, yeah, I know you've moved on a bit from how that story first came, but to me, what got my attention was actually on page 68. On how when he planned his first escape, he still felt the responsibility to the people that when he decided otherwise, did he certainly shake off the unpleasant feeling that he was having, and it just shows that, regardless of what situation we're in, you still are able to discern what the right thing is to do, even if there's something that you feel or think will save you out of something, you still need to dig deep and, really hear what your conscience is saying and actually stick more lean on that side, I mean, he didn't owe his patients anything, if you were. Not that he was getting paid for any help that he was given. And, I mean, the easiest thing, and I think naturally to everyone, the easiest thing is always to save ourselves. But, it was just an indication that sometimes it's not just about ourselves,
Yeah, and you can never really tell. Like, it's in some weird way that if he had tried to escape, then there would be a reasonable chance that he would have died. Because as far as I can tell, like, in order to escape, obviously, one, it's super risky because if you get caught, you'll probably get killed and that by the SS or those kind of people. But when you are escaping, it's seemingly the way that you escape is by running towards the firing line. Like, because those are the people that are trying to get to take over the prison camps, and those are the people that are going to try and save you. But in order to get to them, you have to run towards them, and you don't know if they're going to shoot you or not. So, but yeah, it's some strange way he ended up by wanting to rather look after the patients and try and save them is how he ended up saving himself. And you just never know what's going to happen. It could have been that he stayed there and then he just died because that camp, yeah, was to be sent to the gas chambers next or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so carrying on to page 75, and this is one of Victor's sort of core thoughts. He says that proof that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance, to choose one's own way. Then a little bit further down, even though conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stresses may suggest that inmates were bound to react in certain ways, in final analysis, it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision and not the result of camp influences alone. Fundamentally, therefore, any man can, even under such circumstances, decide what shall become of him, mentally and spiritually. He may retain his human dignity, even in a concentration camp. Yeah.
Funny enough, I had those two sections highlighted.
Nice. Yeah. It's good ones. And the thing is also, it ties back into his meaning ideas. Yeah. Then on page 76, he says, or let me just read from 75. The way they bore their suffering was a genuine inner achievement. It is this spiritual freedom which cannot be taken away that makes life meaningful and purposeful. And then he goes on to say, an active life serves the purpose of giving man the opportunity to realize values in creative work. So this is sort of touching on the different pieces of what is meaningful in life, and the one is creative work. Then he says here, while a passive life is a life of enjoyment, and that affords one the ability of fulfillment in experiencing beauty or art or nature. But then there's also purpose in a life in which there's or a life which is barren of creation and enjoyment. So he says not only creativeness and enjoyment are meaningful. If there's meaning in life at all, there must be meaning in suffering. And then he goes on to say, it may remain brave and dignified and unselfish, or in the bitter fight to self-preservation, one may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. Here lies the chance for a man to either make use of or to forgo the opportunities of attaining moral values that a difficult situation may afford him, and this decides whether he's worthy of his suffering or not. So I think what Frankl is getting at is there's one way, which is like a lot of the modern conception of life would be, you need to create things in order to enjoy life and find fulfillment, or you need to just sort of, I guess, have the ability to do different things, which would then get you the enjoyment by experiencing beauty and things like that. But often, if we can't find that, if we aren't able to have a creative outlet, or if we aren't able to find fulfillment and enjoyment in doing different things and experiencing different things, then we will generally conclude like, okay, but like, what's the point of all this? And he's saying, even in those situations that are barren of both of those, there's still meaning to be found, and specifically meaning in the way that one handles suffering and the moral values that one learns from facing suffering. And yeah, I think I agree with him.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I've
So
read.
yeah, then going to 78, he talks about this idea of provisional existence of unknown limit. So provisional existence as in like sort of just waiting for something. Um, and then of unknown limit as in like it's just never ending. And that's one of the ways that he describes sort of camp life.
Oh.
On page 79, he says, a man who could not see the end of his provisional existence was not able to aim at an ultimate goal in life. He ceased living for the future, in contrast to the man in normal life. The unemployed worker, for example, is in a similar position. His existence has become provisional, and in a certain sense, he cannot live for the future or aim at a goal. Prisoners too suffered from this. Or suffered from a strange time delusion in the camp. A small time unit, a day for example, filled with hourly tortures and fatigue, appeared almost endless. A larger time unit, perhaps a week, seemed to pass very quickly. My comrades agreed when I said in passing in the camp, a day lasted for longer than a week. So yeah, I think that idea of just like what is next, and if you can't see what is next, or if you're waiting in this perpetual state of like, okay, the next thing that is supposed to be the main thing that I'm working towards, but if that's just sort of unknown, and you also don't know when it's going to end, then yeah, I think that can often lead to depression and all of those kind of negative outcomes.
Yeah.
Okay, next on page 82, he says here, and I'll jump through a few little things here as well. He says here, the prisoner who had lost, I think this is the part which you mentioned right in the beginning, Peter. Yeah, you'll see what I mean now. The prisoner who had lost faith in his future was doomed. Then he goes on to page 83. Once I had a dramatic demonstration of the close link between loss of faith in the future and this dangerous giving up. He says here, someone confided in him one day, and he says, the person said to him, I'd like to tell you something, doctor. I've had a strange dream. A voice told me that I could wish for something, and that I should say only what I wanted to know, and all my questions would be answered. What do you think I asked? And he says that I would like to know when the war would be over for me. And then Frankl says to him, what did the dream voice answer? Fervently answered, he whispered to me, March 13th. And that's when this person said to him, his dream, he was at that stage when he told him that it said to him March 13th. This person was still full of hope, and he was convinced by the voice in his dream that it would be right. But as the promised day drew nearer, the war's news reached our camp, made it appear very unlikely that we would be free on the promised date. On March 20th, or 29th, suddenly they became ill. On March 30th, the day his prophecy had told him that the war and suffering would be over for him, he became delirious and lost consciousness. On March 30th, he was dead. To all outward appearances, he had died of typhus. So yeah. Then I have one last thing. Yeah. He says, as we said before, any attempt to restore man's inner strength in the camp had first to succeed in showing him some future goal. Nietzsche's words, he who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. So, yeah, it's that story that you mentioned where this person had this hope, and they had set their hope on this specific date and being free on that date. But as it came closer and closer, then he ended up passing away. And like Frankl says, to all outwards appearances, he basically died of being sick. But to Frankl, he died because he lost hope and meaning. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, a part I'm not interested enough was just before you started reading that section. Let's see if I can find it. On page 82, I think we are talking about suffering, but I think the end of that section, it says, I think it's quoted in a different language, and then it goes, emotion which is suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it. I think and just going back to what you're saying, like the camps were not a good place, and I think even prior to that, it talks about how suffering is also important. That's one thing that doesn't need to be taken away from one's life. It's even, you can go to the extent to say that you do find meaning in suffering. But yeah, the last bits you read, and again, like you said, I did say it at the beginning that, it wasn't that initial suffering that actually killed people, or what is known as suffering that killed people. It was mostly when they lost hope, of what their future has. So yeah, I mean, even you reading again, it still remains interesting to be like, yeah, people can be fine. I mean, in the case of this guy, he was perfectly fine. And I mean, on the surface, people say he also died as typhus, as many patients, people that were sick in the camp. But, if you really dig deep, you'll be like, wait a minute, like, most people were sick much longer than this. It just seemed like he got sick and the next moment he was dead. But I think it all goes back to, like, when you sort of lose the will to live, anything can take you out,
Yeah, it's the timing of it is also just quite something. But yeah. Right, then on to page 93, and this is the third phase. So it's in the first phase was them getting into the camp initially and they were just shocked. The second phase was getting used to camp life and sort of becoming a norm, and they're basically becoming apathetic or desensitized to just things. And yeah, as Victor would say, the emotional death is what that sort of phase or stage was surrounded by. And then phase 3, he says here and I'm going to read through a bunch of pages now again. So it says here on page 91, we now come to the third stage of the prisoner's mental reactions, the psychology of the prisoner after his liberation. Then jumping to page 93, 94. And now to the last chapter in the psychology of the concentration camp, the psychology of the prisoner who has been released. That part of our narrative which told of the morning when the white flag was hoisted above the camp gates after 3 days of high tension. We ventured a few steps out of the camp. This time no orders were shouted at us. Nor was there any need to duck quickly to avoid a blow or a kick. And then he says, freedom, we repeated to ourselves, and yet we could not grasp it. In the evening, we all met again in our hut, and one said secretly to each other, tell me, were you pleased today? And the other replied, feeling ashamed, as if he did not know that we felt similarly. Truthfully, he said, no. We had literally lost the ability to feel pleased and had to relearn it slowly. Then he carries on, Psychologically, what is happening to the liberated prisoners could be called depersonalization. Everything appeared unreal, unlikely, as in a dream. And then to page 97. The way that led from the acute mental tension of these last days in camp, from the war of nerves to mental peace, was certainly not free from obstacles. We have to consider that man who has been under such enormous mental pressure for such a long time is naturally in some danger after his liberation, especially since the pressure was released quite suddenly. This danger, in the sense of the psychological hygiene, is the psychological counterpart to the bends. So the bends is that when you go diving deep and then something about oxygen being squashed or converted to nitrogen or something and not being released from your skin. I don't really know how all this stuff works. And then if you come up quickly, then that change in the stuff not being able to escape from your skin fast enough, and then you, I don't know, not having enough oxygen, and then you basically pass out. That is the clearest explanation of the bends anyone has ever given. So he contrasts it to the bends, and he says, just as the physical health of the worker would be in danger if he left his diver's chamber suddenly, where he was under enormous atmospheric pressure, so the man who had been suddenly liberated from mental pressure can suffer damage to his moral and spiritual health. Yeah, so just like that diver coming up quickly, or it's just traumatic for your body, and you don't know what to do. And then on page 100, he says, this is the concluding part of this whole section. He says, the crowning experience of all for the homecoming man is the wonderful feeling that, after all he has suffered, there is nothing he need fear anymore, except his God. So yeah, in that third phase, there's all of this sort of great joy and stuff to be experienced, but it seems like one is so broken by all of the things that have happened that they basically slowly needed to relearn how to enjoy life and how to walk through life. And there was lots of wonderful benefits of going through that experience and coming out the other side alive, and now getting to live as a free man. But yeah, it still carried a heavy toll. Yeah. Any last thoughts there, Peter?
Yeah, no, nothing. I mean, yeah, like I said earlier that I felt like this part was supposed to be more towards the end, or a summation of the book. But like I said, it gives very good foundation to the next sections of the book. But yeah, also it's just a good look in what life was like then. It does paint a picture of how difficult those times were, and like you said, you don't wish to have, been part of that, and you don't wish we ever get to that point, and I echo that as well.
Yeah, and yet I'm very glad that Victor did write down some of his thoughts and things, because it's something where we can learn a lot about the human spirit and what helps someone to survive in even the most drastic of situations. But yeah. All right, so then let's quickly go through the last bit, which is logotherapy. So this is part 2 of the book. So that was part 1, all of those 3 different stages and all of the different experiences. And then this is now touching on Frankl's therapeutic sort of ideas and which takes, I think it was worked on him by him before camp and also during camp and after camp. And so this is his reflections through the lens of logotherapy on all of the things that have happened, and also giving us a little bit of an idea of what logotherapy is about. So yeah. Page 104, he says here, logotherapy focuses rather on the future, that is to say, on the meanings to be fulfilled by a patient in his future. Logotherapy indeed is a meaning-centered psychotherapy. And he goes on, in logotherapy, the patient is actually confronted and reorientated towards meaning in his life, and to make him aware of this meaning can contribute much to his ability to overcome his neuroses. Logo, or logos, is the Greek word which denotes meaning. According to logotherapy, this striving to find meaning in one's life is the primary motivational force of man. Then he goes on to 105. This meaning is unique and specific in that it must and can be fulfilled by him alone. Only then does it achieve a significance which will satisfy his own will to meaning. So Frankl seems to be saying that from his perspective and logotherapy's perspective, it's not that there is this abstract general meaning that we can all aim towards. He's saying that meaning is the chief thing that we should aim for, but is unique to each person. And later on he says it's even unique to each moment, not just as you have a single meaning for your life, and that's what you need to find, but rather by acting rightly in some sense and doing things in this moment, that is what the meaning of your life is. So yeah. On page 109, he quotes again. Some might be surprised by this quote. He says, there is much wisdom in the words of Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. It's almost like I've heard it before. And then he says, as for myself, when I was taken into the concentration camp of Auschwitz, a manuscript of mine ready for publication was confiscated. And then he carries on to say how this basically trying to reconstruct that meaning. I mean, that manuscript was one of the things that gave him great meaning. Then on 110, I consider it a dangerous misconception of mental hygiene to assume that what man needs in the first place is equilibrium, or is, at least in biology, called homeostasis, a tensionless state. What man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for what is a worthwhile goal, i.e. meaning. So for Frankl, it was his wife and his finishing of his manuscript. But for us, it could be something completely different. Yeah.
I mean, even prior to that, I mean, this is probably something that more of a buzz phrase these days, but I think, I mean, back then, this is what was described as mental health. I mean, it goes still on page 110, but earlier than the part you're reading about equilibrium, and it goes, thus it can be seen that mental health is based on a certain degree of tension, the tension between what one has already achieved and what one still ought to accomplish, or the gap between what one is and what one should become. You know, I think it's that struggle, again, there's that whole measure of tension there. That is what then, you know, gives people the struggles of life. But I mean, like you said, later down there's this, you know, the striving and the struggling for a worthwhile goal is a freely chosen. Like that is what actually gives people meaning. You know, you don't have to kind of worry about the now and the future. It's just a matter of you identifying what it is that keeps you going. What your life is, or what your goal in
Yeah.
life is, and that is what will propel you forward. Nothing else then matters. Essentially, based
Mm.
on this. Yeah.
Yeah. He gives a really nice illustration on page 113. So he says, yeah, the meaning of life differs from man to man, from day to day, and from hour to hour. What matters, therefore, is not the specific meaning of a person's life, um, or, sorry, what matters, therefore, is not the meaning of life in general, but rather the specific meaning of a person's life at a given moment. And then he gives the illustration of a chess champion. He says, uh, tell me, master, what is the best move in the world? And then, of course, he said the answer is, there simply is no such thing as the best or even a good move apart from a particular situation. One should not search for an abstract meaning of life. Everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life to carry out a concrete assignment which demands fulfillment. Herein he cannot be replaced, nor can his life be repeated. Thus, everyone's task is unique, as is his specific opportunity to implement it. So, I think this is something that Frankl is very good at as well, which is sort of drawing those analogies and stories. And I think this is a really helpful one that made it more clear for me what he was sort of meaning by, like, okay, it's different from moment to moment. And it's like he says with the chess champ grandmaster, what's the perfect move? It's like, well, what kind of a question is that? Of course there's not a perfect move. Yeah.
But I mean, with that as well, like I think it just reminds me of how most people would drive themselves to several level of disappointing in oneself if they then also compare their life with someone else. Like you say, it's different. It's not the same. And I mean, further down on that same page, it goes, ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. So to life, he cannot really respond by being responsible. Thus, logotherapy sees the responsibleness, the very essence of human existence. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's like, if I understand what he's saying correctly, it seems like he's saying, normally we say like, oh, what is the meaning of life? But actually life is looking at us and saying like, what are you doing? And that is your meaning. That is the meaning of life for you in that particular chess move, to draw the analogy. It's like, for us right now, the meaning is to, or the meaningful thing for us to do is to carry on talking and finishing up the podcast. But in the next moment, it might be something completely different. It might be that the meaningful thing is me going to watch a movie with my wife, or whatever the case is. And those are the things that are meaningful. But yeah, we want to look for this like abstract meaning. And Frankl's like, I don't think that's a good idea, buddy. Yeah. There's another nice analogy that he gives on page 114. He says here, to put it figuratively, the role played by a logotherapist is that of an eye specialist rather than that of a painter. A painter tries to convey to us a picture of the world as he sees it. An ophthalmologist tries to enable us to see the world as it really is. I think his phrasing is wrong there. I think he should have said, an ophthalmologist tries to enable us to see the world from our point of view. Because, yeah, the whole as it
It's
really
from
is, and yeah.
yeah, it's from our point of view and as it is. It's like you're
Yeah, so,
seeing the world.
sorry, say again.
Oh, sorry. I was saying it's the ophthalmologist allows us to see the world as it is, you know, uh, because
Yeah,
we're using our. But I get what you mean that it's like from our perspective, but it's not. I feel like that's not one thing you need perspective. Okay, I'm also, but yeah, I'm not
I think,
explaining myself well there, but
yeah, I think my caveat is just like on like reality and perception, and is it really the way?
yeah,
There's like the case against reality and all kinds of stuff that's kind of an irrelevant tangent. But
yeah,
the
because
point is, sorry,
yeah, but I was gonna say like when you kind of say it as perspective isn't it also drawn on understanding?
yes, yeah. But think about what, like, from, because he's talking about logotherapy here, and he's sort of
Mm.
trying to draw this analogy of like a painter would paint something and then be like, this is what it's like.
Yeah,
Um, and then whereas, and obviously that's not always the case, abstract art, etc. Yeah. But painter paints something and then this is what
yeah,
it's
but
actually like.
also,
But
mm-hmm.
then
Go on.
from logotherapy's perspective, it's sort of saying like you need to find the meaning for yourself. Don't seek for this abstract meaning. Seek for the meaning from your perspective,
For you, yeah,
essentially.
yeah, yeah. Okay,
and
yeah.
and that's what he's saying. The ophthalmologist helps us see, and so the logotherapist helps one see what the meaning is from their perspective, or from the patient's perspective, rather than from the logotherapist's perspective, because the logotherapist's perspective is his own meaning.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
But yeah, but it's also like a whole discussion to be like, is there not some deeper meaning and things like that? And that's a different discussion. And I think that there's elements of truth there as well. But I don't think this completely disregards that. So, yeah. Cool. Should we move on to the next page?
Yes, please.
Cool. So the next page says here, according to logotherapy, we can discover this meaning in life in three different ways, and this has kind of been touched on before, but by creating work or doing a deed, or by experiencing something or encountering someone, and the last one is by the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering. Yeah, those are the three areas, and it was touched on a little bit before as well. Then jumping forward to page 28. Let me go there. So he says here, in starting treatment, Dr. Eva Kozdera recommended the patient that he do just the opposite of what he had usually done. Namely, instead of trying to write as neatly and legitimately as possible, rather to write with the worst possible scrawl. He was advised to say to himself, I will now show people that I am the best scribbler. Within 48 hours, the patient was in this way freed from his writer's cramp and remained free from for the observation period after he had been treated. He was a happy man and was then again able to fully work. And then on the next page, paradoxical intention can also be applied to cases of sleep disturbance. To overcome this particular fear, I usually advise the patient not to try to sleep, but rather to do just the opposite, that is, to stay awake for as long as possible. Paradoxical intention is no panacea, yet it lends itself as a useful tool in treating obsessive-compulsive and phobic conditions, especially in cases with underlying anticipatory anxiety. So, to be very honest, I don't really know how this fits in to the camp life and all of those kind of things. But I don't know if it's intended to or not, but it's a aspect of logotherapy that I thought would be helpful just to mention, because I think it is something that we've seen in previous books as well to some degree, and they touch on it well here, but they give it a different name, paradoxical intention, which is basically focusing on the opposite of the thing that you, because normally we would think, okay, if I want to sleep, I need to like sort of be like, okay, I must go to sleep now. I must really focus on going to sleep, because otherwise I'm just going to carry on being awake, and I don't want to be awake. I need to sleep. And paradoxical intention is saying focus your intentions on the opposite of the thing that you think you should be focusing your attention on, because we in those cases of anticipatory anxiety, we get so caught up in the thing that we want to achieve that we end up just not being able to. And so, for anyone listening that is in that situation, logotherapy suggests that, and I think it's not a bad idea. But it is not, as he says, it's no like golden bullet, but it is a useful tool to try. So, random interjection from your sponsor, logotherapy. Cool. Then on page 136, and this is sort of the end of the section of logotherapy. He says here, after all, man is the being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also the being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Israel on his lips. So, it's the paradox of man, I guess. Okay, I'm going to read two last quotes, and then that is pretty much it. So on page 145, so this is now the final section or postscript of 1984, as he says, the case for tragic optimism. And then he just explains here that tragic optimism in brief means that one is and remains optimistic in spite of the tragic triad, which is pain, guilt, and death. So then the quotes on page 145. I'd like to clarify that in the first place, the logotherapist is concerned with the potential meaning inherent and dormant in the single situations one has to face throughout his or her life. Therefore, I will not be elaborating here on the meaning of one's life as a whole, although I do not deny that such long-ranging meaning does exist. To invoke an analogy, consider a movie. It consists of thousands upon thousands of individual pictures, and each of them makes sense and carries a meaning. Yet the meaning of the whole film cannot be seen before its last sequence is shown. Isn't it the same with life? Doesn't the final meaning of life, too, reveal itself, if at all, only at its end, on the verge of death? And doesn't this final meaning, too, depend on whether or not the potential meaning of each single situation has been actualized to the best of the respective individual's knowledge and belief? The fact remains that meaning and its perception as seen from logotherapeutic angle is completely down to earth rather than aloft, than afloat in the air or resident in an ivory tower. And then lastly, he says here, researchers at the Yale University School of Medicine have, and then he quotes, have been impressed by the number of prisoners of war in the Vietnam War who explicitly claimed that although their captivity was extraordinarily stressful and filled with torture, disease, malnutrition, and solitary confinement, they nevertheless benefited from the captivity experience, seeing it as a growth experience. So yeah, that is man's search for meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Some concluding thoughts, Peter.
Yeah, I think it was also just some of the things, again, like you said, that don't relate to the first part of the book. But I mean, those, I think it was mentioned in the chapter before, but actually spoken about again on page 143 about existential vacuum, you know. Apparently that's what gives that feeling, is what kind of leads to a few things. I'll read something here. I know it's just like okay, I'll start from there. It says, just consider the Masneric syndrome of pervasiveness in a young generation. There an ample empirical evidence that the three facets of this syndrome, depression, aggression, addiction, are due to what is called in logotherapy, the existential vacuum, a feeling of emptiness and meaningless. You know, it's always like spoken about that, like, I mean, not an expert, but things like depression, you know, aggression is, you know, it's as a result of you searching for something, you know, and it's just something that seems out of reach. And again, as it says, it's the opposite of logotherapy, because logotherapy is about existing, you know, it's about you finding meaning in something. And the moment that seems to be very far, then it creates that void, you know, and as a result, it manifests in those things like depression and aggression. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to add. But yeah, like you said, it's just it's interesting how some of the things mentioned in this you can't seem to make a link with the first part, but there is a link, because at the end of the day, it kind of, the first part is about how people survive because of the hope that there's this other life, and that's what they were searching for, to get, like, for instance, for him to meet his wife again, to finish his manuscripts. And yeah. But yeah, my last thoughts, I think we all said this, but I think if you're not too much into history, I would just say still get the book and read the last parts of the book. I feel like there's a lot that's condensed in there. But again, like, if you want, you know, some human-like examples, then the first part really gives good examples to the different aspects of life, and how you can navigate through those situations, and live things through, essentially.
I think the points that you raised about the existential vacuum, and basically just the fact that if one finds themselves in that situation where they just don't know what their meaning is, it's a very dangerous thing. And like mentioned in the book, that's where depression and those kind of things can stem from, if there is that existential vacuum of like, what is the point of all of this? And I think that this book helps. It's not going to be the thing that solves all the problems, but I think it helps, and it gives a good perspective of how to approach those kind of situations. And in some ways, it reminds me of that book that I often mention to people, which is 4,000 Weeks, where finding meaning in those little things, like washing the dishes and doing things like that, that those things that we often feel are just pointless and meaningless, or cleaning one's house or looking after the garden, and we just like, it's not worth doing. It's either just like a pointless thing or a meaningless thing, but actually there's a lot of meaning in all of those kind of situations, and obviously especially family and friendship and community and that. And I think that this book helps to refocus on that, and to try and see it as well through the lens of just how horrific things can be, and yet meaning can still be found there. And how the prisoners have all these different experiences and get drawn back to the things that are really meaningful. Like in their, they mentioned how they had those religious sort of spiritual deepening and things like that. Whereas like often we will just in the modern world be extremely materialistic and things, and there's value in material goods, but we can survive with a lot less of that than we think, despite the fact that I'll carry on with all my materialistic stuff. I can now just comfortably say this from my comfortable chair, and yeah. But yeah, definitely agree. Getting a copy of the book and reading it. It's another short one and worthwhile.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, Peter. We will chat again.
Cool.